natural history includes the long-tailed white tropic birds that migrate to our skies and rock faces, the North Atlantic humpback whale that comes to our warm waters to give birth to and nurse their young, the critically endangered hawksbill turtle, and the St. Vincent parrot. These are all creatures that the National Trust seeks to protect for future generations. For more than 40 years, the National Trust has worked to save St. Vincent and the Grenadines' most beloved places, landscapes, and seascapes where great moments of history took place. We work together with communities to value and protect important pieces of our cultural community, national history, and environment, such as the series of decorated saladoid pots found in Clear Valley, signifying that St. Vincent's civilization is almost 2,000 years old. We do this all because the next generation needs to know our stories, as they will only inherit the places and species we choose to save today. We urge you to plant a tree under whose shade you never plan to sit. Join the National Trust today.
Members of the Board of the National Trust, our honoree Mr. Morrison Baisden and his family, former Minister Baptiste, other former members of the Board of the National Trust, staff of the National Trust, teachers, students, members of the media, and our colleagues who will be performing for us. A pleasant good afternoon to one and all. I am particularly pleased that the Board of the National Trust is joined by those of you who have made that deliberate decision to be a part of this evening's proceedings. The National Trust cannot function without the community. And I believe that is particularly exemplified in the service which has been rendered to the National Trust and to St. Vincent and the Grenadines by Mr. Baisden over the years. Those of us who have a love for the natural history, built history, and other forms of heritage in St. Vincent, at some point in time would have interacted with him. I believe, if not all, most of the schools in St. Vincent, particularly the secondary schools, would have at one point or another sought to have his services in terms of sharing his knowledge. I remember profoundly taking the Heritage Club to a place called Farm in the Mespo-Marico area, and our guide then was Mr. Baisden. At that time, I was not even aware of the profound wealth of knowledge he had, but as that journey ended, I became more engaged with him as a member of the National Trust. I believe that there needs to be a continuity. Those who know and those who need to know. Not everything that we need to know, particularly in our local history, and in St. Vincent is a particularly good case of that, is written down. Much of it remains in the memory of our seniors, and sometimes we are so busy with our personal lives that we do not pause for a moment and share those precious moments with them. Students, how many of you have had a chance to speak with your grandparents or even great-grandparents and to find out from them where their generations, where in St. Vincent did their grandparents come from? Where are we? Are they even Vincentians at that stage? How much do you know? One of the things I love to do when I'm teaching history is to have the young ones do something called their family tree. And very often they cannot go beyond their grandparents. So you see, there is a disconnect. What Mr. Baisden did is that he spent much of his life trying to bridge that gap. that cannot be written in a textbook word for word. And so this evening, we are very pleased that the National Trust would have paused to reflect on your life and on your contribution to nation building. I don't know if I'm at liberty to share, maybe I shouldn't disclose the name of the trustee who, discussed and said that it is so important and had the full support of the National Trust in recognizing your work. We are pleased that you actually came and your family is with you so that we can publicly say thank you, Mr. Baisden, for your contribution to the young people and to nation building. Thank you very much, sir.
I want to join with you, Mrs. Hamilton, in saying that our search for our ancestry is so important. I have been on a journey myself for the past couple of years and found my father, and I'm hoping to find my biological mom soon as we continue on this ancestral search. It is very, very important, and I'm so happy to be associated with our National Trust on this initiative this afternoon. At this point in time, we're going to be having Ronette Bunting. I'm subject to correction here. Ronette Bunting, Vinci Dance Ensemble, the dance group. That's a special presentation. We invite them to come, please. Encourage them with a round of applause.
Garifuna heritage.
Maxine Brown Dance Group for that energetic performance. Please, again, another round of applause. So mine was a journey that I started while I was at the High Commission in London. I wanted to know more about the Garifuna people and what was it that, as Vincentians, we would have taken from the roots from some of our indigenous peoples. And we are where we are today. Thank you once again. At this time, put our hands together once more to welcome Mr. Fitzgerald Providence to do our citation.
Pleasant good afternoon to all. Honorable Minister Mackey, Honorable Rene, the members, the chair and members of the present board of the National Trust, past members and members all, and our special guest, Mr. Edward Morrison Baisden. It's given me great pleasure to present the citation for Mr. Morrison Baisden. It's a challenge because his career spans so many things, and I hope I give justice to it. I may be biased not to the heritage but to the natural history because that's my upbringing, but I hope I do justice to this. I met Mr. Baisden over 33 years ago. Well, also I forgot to recognize the many students that are here, because we all are students of history, of natural history, of ecology, archaeology in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and sometimes we get lost. And that's how I grew up into this. I became a student, and I'm still a student of natural history, archaeology, because the more we learn, the less we know about our heritage, our nation. So I'll continue in the citation. Well, I met Mr. Baisden about over 33 years ago when I joined the Ministry of Agriculture as a young forestry officer. And there seemed to be a sort of group that formed around Dr. Kirby, Dr. Earl Kirby, in that I was invited to start to meet Dr. Earl Kirby and start to formation around these younger people at that time, in terms of getting to know the natural history, the archaeology of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and then I became a part of the National Trust at that time. But in terms of focusing on, through this relationship, I built a lot of knowledge in terms of the natural history and somewhat the archaeology of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. That always makes me recognize the beauty of our anthem in our mountains so high, so clear and green. And that is one of the things we should always recognize: our nature, our heritage, our natural history, our archaeology, that makes our country a blessed nation. Now, so I always say we are incorporated to this group of young sleuths that are out there investigating the archaeology or learning about the archaeology and the natural history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And through this unique relationship, I got to know Mr. Baisden, Dr. Kirby, Mr. Baisden, as we hang out a lot. Sometimes in this building, it was not as bright then, it was more dark. There was, Dr. Kirby sat out front there, and there was some displays around, and there was a canoe in the middle. And it's good that we are now recognizing Mr. Baisden here, because this building holds a lot of history and lessons. If the walls could speak, they would tell you of a lot of the conversations that took place that were the lessons of learning about the archaeology and natural history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'll just go into a bit of the career of Mr. Baisden. He was a student of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Grammar School, or the Boys Grammar School. And it was during leaving grammar school and joining the Ministry of Agriculture that he was caught into the group with Dr. Kirby to go and start investigating, sleuthing around in terms of the digs at different parts of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And after leaving grammar school and then joining the Ministry of Agriculture, this relationship built up. Then he went on to the Eastern Caribbean Institute of Agriculture and Forestry, an institute that I can say most, if not all, of the persons in agriculture would have passed through. All the technocrats in agriculture would have passed through. That institute is now a part of the University of Trinidad and Tobago, sorry. It was incorporated into the University of Trinidad and Tobago, but we still have persons from St. Vincent and the Grenadines who go to that institute. And I'm a graduate of the forestry aspect. Now, after his return to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, he continued to work in agriculture, and he was posted to the crop protection unit. And his location was in an archaeological historical area, which is the old cotton ginnery, and I hope most of the people in this room can see where that is. The old cotton ginnery in the middle of Kingstown, well, not middle, more of the eastern side of Kingstown, just behind the University Center, University of the West Indies Center there, the old cotton ginnery in there. And you will see some of the cotton ginnery works still in the University Center yard and the old buildings around there. So there's where he started to work in terms of crop protection. And then he was stationed off to Winban, the Windward Island bananas. That was when banana was it. And there was a lot of work about crop protection and bananas. And he worked in the communications area in that regional institution. It was after this, after working with Winban, he then moved on to the Caribbean Conference of Churches. And I hope we can remember that institution and that organization, and the production they made, which was Caribbean Contact. That was a newsletter, a short newspaper that was produced. I can remember it. And he worked with them as a project officer for a short stint. And then after that, he came back to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and he worked with the Development Corporation. And then is where I'll go into his archaeological, natural history work with Doc, as I said, and recorded from Dr. Kirby's son, Ashley Kirby. He remembered as a youngster in around 1965 that Mr. Baisden was involved with a dig in Queensberry, a dig actually, an archaeological site dig of about 8 feet by 10 feet, where he remembered that clearly as a youngster back in 1965, some 55 years ago, that is where they saw this dig in terms of that. Also, a group of people which included persons like, along with Dr. Kirby, Parnell Campbell, Stanley Campbell, Jan Horn, and Lorna Small, and Morrison Baisden, and others met on Sundays and used to dig bits of pottery from different parts of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, walking in the blazing hot sun, and discovering and learning about the natural history of the archaeological history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And some of these shards from these digs were in these halls, and also some are still in storage in the basement of the Carnegie building, if I'm sure they're still there. And so it was a lot of work in the hot sun to build that natural, that knowledge of the archaeological history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. This historical site that the dig was situated near the bank of the small stream tributary to the Bookament River in the Queensberry district, as I said. It was 2 miles away from the Bookament Bay. And if you know where Queensberry is now, it's more developed now, a lot of housing. And I think it's in that area, the youngsters will know where the bush bar is. And it was in terms of these digging along the stream banks and so on, and the alluvial deposits and all these, they were able to uproot the Amerindian shards of pottery, which I said are now in different areas stored. And one of the things that developed over these years is that there was the formation of a group Corley, a number of persons came together under the guide of Dr. Kirby to form the Archaeological and Historical Society of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And this group got together, and I showed some of those members I mentioned before, and they did the digs in the different parts of St. Vincent, mainly St. Vincent, and probably some in the Grenadines. And this group also produced some bulletins. I was able, in talking to Mr. Baisden, to see some of the small bulletins that they, news bulletins that they created on pre-Columbian monuments in stone. I hope that somehow we can, if there are more, we can rescue them and we can scan them and we can save them. So, because they build a part of our archaeological history in St. Vincent and Grenadines, learning about ourselves from whence we came. And one other things that we were able to get is persons from outside, archaeologists, persons who are really trained in archaeology, because you know Dr. Kirby was a vet by training, and Mr. Baisden was agriculturalist by training, so they weren't archaeologists. So we had archaeologists that came in to the country who helped them in terms of putting together publications, and one which you showed me was by Bullen, which again looked at the pre-Columbian monuments in stone in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So Mr. Baisden continued over the years, and the Archaeological and Historical Society became the National Trust, came into the National Trust of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and he continued to serve in this organization for many years, and I think up to recent times, it still continued. I'm sure they still touch base with him to find out some things or his knowledge will still bring to us. And it's important that a lot of these things are not written in books, and we need to always take time to capture them. And it's an opportune time here that we are in our Heritage Month, and we're actually at the beginning of the Heritage Month, where we can recognize someone like Mr. Baisden, who has contributed to St. Vincent and the Grenadines in many ways. And it's also encouraging that with the amount of young people here, he was able to teach not with chalk and blackboard, but with speaking, with going out with students, with walking into the different areas, that you are able to learn practically rather than from a textbook. And this is one of the things that we should always remember, that learning is continual, and we must not only use a textbook, but we must listen to the persons who have the knowledge. So I hope I've given justice to this citation for Mr. Baisden, and again, I just want to thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Providence. Ladies and gentlemen, just a little thing popped into my head that I have to share with you before I bring on this other speaker. She put me on a little spot here. We have history within the cooperative movement years ago. So before our trustee, Mrs. Louise Mitchell Joseph, comes to do that, I want to say this. Long upon the mountains weary, have the scattered flocks or have the scattered Vincentians been torn? Dark the desert paths and dreary, grievous trials have they borne. Now the gathering call is sounding, solemn in its warning voice. Union, faith, and love abounding. Bid us as Vincentians rejoice. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the great pleasure this afternoon inviting Sister Rene Baptiste just to give us a few tidbits, just a word of encouragement just before Sister Mrs. Louise Mitchell Joseph. I say sister because I'm accustomed with this credit union, the credit union movement, greeting by saying sister and brother. Please welcome Sister Rene Baptiste.
Well, that's quite a surprise. Good afternoon, everyone. Honorable Minister, Honoree, I see the Chairman Emeritus of the St. Vincent Grenadines
Board of Trustees. I named her that, Mrs. Cathy Martin. She's done so much work with us. And of course, our honored guest. While Mr. Providence was speaking, I remember it was in 1969 that I met Doc Kirby through my mother, who was then working at the Ministry of Agriculture. And she said, I want you to meet somebody, and he will tell you a lot of things about St. Vincent. And then we were at the time moving over to grammar school, because it wasn't a co-ed school, residential co-ed, until 1969 November. And I also met a gentleman called Mr. Inky Williams, who was a surveyor and rose to chief surveyor. We had no geography teacher, so Mr. Inky Williams had to take us out to show us all the different physical geography features for A-levels. What is a conical hill? And so we went out to King's Forest and so on. That's when I met Dr. Kirby and also met Mr. Baisden. Fast forward, then my mother told me you should join the National Trust because you'll learn a lot of things. Because Dr. Kirby knows a lot about the history. And she told me that after she left, then went to the audit department to work on promotion. The National Trust was at the time, the books used to be audited by the Senior Examiner of Accounts of the audit department, which was then my mother. And the accounts used to be made up by Mrs. Margaret Hughes Ferrari. And then you started to learn all these things about the National Trust, what it does, and what all these things would be following after that, long after that. So we fast forward to the year 2001. And I was then appointed Minister of Tourism and Culture. The downstairs of the Carnegie Library was all dusty and flaky. The back of it was leased to Alliance Francaise, and the upstairs. And so I went through some books that were there and called Mr. Baisden, Cecil Ryan, and a number of persons and say, we need to get the National Trust up and running again. And Mr. Baisden was very cautious. He said, usually, politicians and political patronage just lasts for a while. I told him, well, not with me. I'm serious. Because you see, I was coming from a different perspective. I was not coming from the perspective of being somebody who was thrust into being a politician. But because I had that connection from the Ministry of Agriculture and knowing and listening to the stories of Doc Kirby, that this was real to me. And we owe a debt of gratitude to persons like Mr. Baisden and Cecil Ryan and Mrs. Martin for persisting. These chairs were some of the first things they got, and a little sound system, and cleaned up the place. Then we started to get students who were doing their master's degree in archaeology coming to St. Vincent to do digs. And one of the digs was at what is now the Argyle International Airport, where they found skeletons, burial place it would appear, and going there and seeing this. So were it not for persons like Mr. Baisden, with their persistence and the love of the country, wanting to pass on that history. Recently, I was asking some other persons, do you know what can happen, what's something new? And Mr. Providence here, when you meet kindred souls, things just happen, and they happen right. So the Ministry of Agriculture, we're going to put together some books, and they started first with a book on the breadfruit. And it surprised the daylights out of a lot of people to know that Lago Heights had the most variety of breadfruit, and not South Rivers, now Maracua. There is so much to learn, students. It's so fascinating to learn about your roots and your past. And I built my knowledge by listening to people like Mr. Baisden, who, when I'm going up by my sister's house in Edinburgh, he was on the veranda with Doc Kirby. If it were not for them, many of us wouldn't know what we know today, or have such a love for our natural history and archaeology. And having to do extra travel as a minister, especially comes to mind is going to Guyana for Carifesta, and going into the section with the Amerindians. And there, for the first time, I was able to recognize the different tribes of Arawaks and the different tribes of Caribs. And they walked me through and showed me the difference. How do you know the difference in what they do? It's the artwork. And it made you feel happy and pleased that the work of the National Trust persisted and continued with kindred spirits up to today. So that one Independence morning, people called from Clare Valley, where they were going to dig a toilet for a spiritual Baptist church, and came upon pottery and saucers stacked up. And they didn't take a pickaxe and hit it. They used their hands. Don't let today's recognition of Mr. Baisden just become something he looks at when he becomes an old man. He's just an older person now. But let him hear that in this room, some history student would write a book about those discoveries in this early part of the 21st century. So that you would feel in the forward, you would put that I was at a ceremony to recognize Mr. Morrison Baisden and heard more from other persons about the archaeology and the history of St. Vincent, and how fascinating it is. It's not going to be written by anybody from London. It must be written by you, so that your name must be there. You're saying to yourself, but she might be dead by that time. I will haunt you. You will hear Jambi, and I will call you and tell you I know you were here. So keep that in mind, and remember today that the work Mr. Baisden did is the reason you are here. And you go and find out. You go to National Trust and find out more, not only about Mr. Baisden, but about the work he did. That will give you a love that will last a lifetime. Mr. Baisden, thank you so much for your persistence, for your love. This is what you call love of country, Finding your roots and wanting to know why what those petroglyphs, what they mean. And it's when you get an opportunity and you go elsewhere. When we went up to Colombia, and we saw those similar markings, like the hieroglyphics on the petroglyphs, and they're making gold chains and selling them at duty free, and we're not making gold chains in St. Vincent. Our craftsmen have not yet latched on to the love of the ancestors. You remember today that this man had a love for his ancestors, and he wrote it down, and he would talk with you and he would speak with you. Remember him and his work, with the National Trust and for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Congrats, Mr. Baisden.
Thank you very much, Sister Rene, and I have learned quite a lot as well. You are a historian in your own right. Another round of applause. Land of my birth, I pledge to thee my loyalty and devotion. At this point in time, we call to the podium Trustee, fellow trustee, Mrs. Louise Mitchell Joseph. Please give her a round of applause.
Good afternoon, Honorable Cecil Mackey, Honorable Rene Baptiste, former Minister of Culture, Speaker of the OECS House of Assembly, former Chairperson of the National Trust, Mrs. Kathy Martin, our honoree today, Mr. Morrison Baisden, Chairperson of the National Trust, Mrs. Decima Hamilton, other members of the board, Manager of the Trust, Mrs. Laverne Bentic Phillips, members of the media, and most importantly of all, the students that are here today. Welcome to you all. It's my role today on behalf of the present board of the National Trust to express our appreciation and gratitude to Mr. Morrison Baisden for his years of service on the board of the National Trust and his years of service in preserving the heritage of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Through his years of working with Dr. Kirby, he would have acquired a lot of knowledge and a lot of information, which he has preserved and passed on. I've been informed that he even preserved certain artifacts that he would have found, and he ensured that they made their way to the National Trust. Sitting on the board of trustees with Mr. Baisden over the years has been a learning experience for me, because we'll be having some discussion, and in the middle of it all, Mr. Baisden would just throw out this amazing historical fact. And it was always just amazing to me how much Mr. Baisden knows. And my only regret is that not enough of this has been documented. And I remember there was a group of students from the Sugar Mill Academy that came to the National Trust once, and Mr. Baisden was giving them a lecture about our history, the history of the Amerindians in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and one of the teachers was getting frustrated with him because he wouldn't say when the Caribs first came to St. Vincent, and so she actually came out and asked him, when did the Caribs arrive? And Mr. Baisden looked at her and said, there's no such thing as Caribs. Well, the lady just freaked out at that point. But the reason that he was saying that, of course, is the word Carib is a derogatory word which should not be taught, should not be repeated, and there are better words and more appropriate words that should be used. And again, I would like to appeal to the government, as you hear, Minister Mackey. I don't know if anyone in a position of authority in the Ministry of Education has ever sat down with Mr. Morrison Baisden to get from him his version of what our history is. There's a version of history that is still being taught in our schools, which is completely biased by our colonial writers of history. And Mr. King, I forgive me, former principal of the grammar school, I recognize you now as well. Our true history still is not being taught in our schools. The history that we know is more authentic one, the one that's in the minds of people like Morrison Baisden, still has not translated into our curriculum. And while we have treasures like Mr. Morrison Baisden still with us, I appeal to the government, I appeal to every one of you students there. Find some time, if Mr. Baisden would have you, and sit down with him and ask him to tell the true history of St. Vincent, so that a more authentic history is developed for our students and for our identity as a whole. I just also want to say that Mr. Baisden has been a wonderful trustee in terms of his dedication to the work of the National Trust. I remember when we were going through the process of removing the petroglyphs out at Argyle, moving them to another location in order to save them. Mr. Baisden was on site practically every day, and so much so that Dr. Monica Beron, who was the the head of the team from Argentina. She even had a pet name for him. That was Bibi. She was talking about Bibi, and I'm like, who is this Bibi? And I was like, well, you've just come into this country and you have a pet name for this man, and I don't. But anyways, so he really gave of his time generously to everyone who was interested in archaeology and to the National Trust. So Mr. Baisden, I just want to take this opportunity on behalf of the board to say thank you to you. And although you're no longer on the board of the trust, I hope that you will continue to give of your service to this country, and in particular to the students and anyone who's interested in history who would listen, so that we'd have a more authentic version of our history being taught. It really pains me that our curriculum hasn't developed more than it has. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Louise Mitchell-Joseph, one of our trustees, very able trustee as well. At this point in time, we call to the podium Honorable Minister Cecil Mackey, Minister of Tourism, and we are asking you to give some brief remarks thereafter to do the presentation. Please welcome.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Honorable Rene Baptiste, Speaker of the OECS House of Assembly, students gathered here, members of St. Vincent and the Grenadines National Trust, historians, members of the media, one and all. Let me first of all apologize for not being with you from the beginning of the program. I don't know if it was explained that today is Cabinet Day, unusual Cabinet Day. We normally have Cabinet on Wednesday, but Cabinet is today, so I had to run out of Cabinet. So I might have to run away from you before you end as well to rejoin Cabinet. What a day, what a man. I recall, and I see some of my schoolmates here, in the 60s, when you wanted to find out anything about St. Vincent and the Grenadines, anything, you checked either Dr. Kirby or Mr. Baisden. Mr. Baisden almost looks the same today as he looked then. That's a compliment. You still look very young and fit. And I know you do the beach thing every morning, and maybe that's a lesson that we can take from Mr. Baisden. Go to the beach every morning, take a swim, and you would remain young almost forever. So in those days, as you just heard from Mr. Providence, Mr. Baisden worked at the Ministry of Agriculture, but yet the country knew that you could count on him to recap any detail of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'm happy that he became a part of the National Trust. And you just heard from Sister Rene that she was instrumental in getting the trust up and running again. And today, they are not only up and running, they're very vibrant. At the Ministry of Tourism, Sports and Culture, we have worked very closely with the National Trust over the years. And I'm sure that they would be looking forward to the time when we can say, okay, let us increase the subvention. And I can assure you that the work that you're doing now and this particular program will add significantly to your profile to convince the powers that be that we need to look at that as a very important aspect of the continued journey to capture the history and heritage of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. One of the things that we have fallen short of across all aspects of life in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is capturing our history. And history is not a very attractive and, as the people would say, sexy subject. So you have not as many historians as we should have in a developing country. So we still have to rely on a large part by persons like Mr. Baisden to provide the information that allows us to understand a little better what took place and what the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines is all about. As we celebrate our 40th anniversary of independence, we did so last year, one of the things that we consciously did, aware of the fact that this is a shortcoming, we identified 4 Vincentians: Dr. Adrian Fraser, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Denny, and Dr. Scott. And we have tasked them with the responsibility of capturing the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. They've indicated that they will do so in 2 series. And I'm absolutely sure, to satisfy the concern of Mrs. Joseph, that they will be sitting with Mr. Baisden to get an account as he sees it, as he experiences it, as he understands it, the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So, Mr. Baisden, you can look forward to being contacted by any or all of those gentlemen as they go forward with that project. And we hope that at the conclusion of that exercise, that those volumes will become critical to us better understanding our history and our heritage. So that's something that we can look forward to. Students, take note of that. The Ministry of Tourism, Sports and Culture, we ourselves, we are aware of the fact that we need to do several other things, particularly so as we now welcome many more persons to our destination, not only returning Vincentians, but also visitors to the destination. So we need to have that available, that information available to us, so we could use that to market the destination and to sell the destination. The National Trust, they themselves would have a very packed schedule in terms of activities for 2020. And the ministry ourselves, we have a more than packed program this year. A couple of things I would want to point to. The Cayo Village at Argyle, Sister Rene mentioned it, that we discovered some very important remains out there that would allow us to establish a Cayo Village, only one of its type in the region. And this year we'll go forward with another phase of that project. We did one phase already, so we'll be going forward aggressively to complete another phase of that project so that we can allow it to become another heritage tourism site here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We'd also work closely with the National Trust as they themselves set up their park out at Argyle. The Ministry of Tourism, Sports and Culture, we would also be doing a number of festivals this year, and within those festivals will be the opportunity to capture a lot of the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In August this year, we would be hosting the 2nd year of the Garifuna Homecoming. That would also allow us to showcase and highlight a lot of the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And we would be working along with a number of other individuals. I see our a good sister here who is also a part of the National Trust, and she would also be providing us with information as we go forward with those projects. But this afternoon, today, belongs to Mr. Baisden. Mr. Baisden, I want you to understand that not only those gathered in the room here this afternoon, that we love you very much. The National Trust, I'm sure that they have echoed that to you repeatedly, being part of that body. They love you, but I want to say to you that the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we love you and we treasure you. You are truly a national treasure and a gem of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. That is coming from my heart, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of us here this afternoon. So congratulations, Mr. Baisden. Congratulations for the National Trust for coming up with this recognition and award program as we celebrate our month, National Heroes and Heritage Month. Couldn't find a more appropriate time. couldn't find a more appropriate year and couldn't find a more appropriate individual. I want to ask you to put your hands together for Mr. Morrison Baisden, the gem of our program this afternoon.
We call Mr. Baisden, please. We call him forward. And the chair, Mrs. Hamilton, come please in terms of the presentation.
If I can just read, St. Vincent and the Grenadines National Trust recognizes and appreciates the services of Mr. Morrison Edward Baisden for your dedication to the preservation of the history and heritage in St. Vincent and the Grenadines from the year 1969 to 2020. That doesn't mean that he was born in 1969, but that is when he focused, putting all of this information together for us in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Put your hands together one more time for Morrison.
Sister Martin, Sister Kathy Martin, come please.
Yes.
Come, Shorty.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's not at all often for me to be addressing a group like this. Young, bright people and middle-aged, brighter people and a few old people like me, one or two. And I basically want to say to you in a few short words some of the things that were important and that are important to us now. When I joined the Historical Society many moons ago, we thought that we had a lot of information available in places around St. Vincent, and it really scared us to find out that there really wasn't a lot. But we knew where it was in different parts of the world. And Dr. Kirby in particular set out to collect this information as far as possible. And we did collect quite a lot of it from West Indians and from the Germans at one stage and other people who had been studying the history of St. Vincent. I just want to say that I am happy to have been permitted to be with this group of interesting people and to meet those people who came in to St. Vincent whenever they came and allowed me to speak with them and sometimes take notes from them, and agree above all else that they would share whatever information was available to St. Vincent with the Historical Society and later on with the National Trust. We haven't done as much as we can do, but there's a lot more information available when we get some of the people in this room together, some of the students in particular, share the information with them and probably have them delve a little deeper into what is now available. I just want to read a little thing that I scratched here. I am happy to have been permitted to be among these fine Vincentians, Caribbean people, and their associates, and from outside the region, who have participated in various ways in remembering and recording the heritage of the peoples who at one time or another lived on our shores. In my time, the most outstanding of these was Dr. Earl Kirby. And I was fortunate to have spent many hours with him in the field, in his home, and in his office over a very long period of time. Permit me to salute Dr. Kirby and the outstanding contributions he made to St. Vincent and the Grenadines within his profession and towards St. Vincent's history and archaeology. Today I feel honored to have known him and to have had the opportunity to have learned much at his feet. This evening, I must thank the St. Vincent National Trust for noting in this special way the very small contribution I have made while I had the honor to walk with you in the mountains, in the valleys, along the rivers, and in the seashores. My life has been greatly enhanced by the experience, and I want to thank you all, and I look forward to walking with you and learning from you while life and health shall last. Thank you.
Shall we just stand to salute Mr. Baisden for his years of service with me? Just want to make a very special request as you stand to our teachers to try to make a special effort to do that bridge with our local history with your students. On behalf of the National Trust, I thank you very much for saluting Mr. Baisden, Madam Chair. It's over to you, Mr. Baisden.
A journey of 1,000 miles begin with one step. May you make this step in the right direction, in the history direction, whatever direction it is, and may God bless you.
Our natural history includes the long-tailed white tropic birds that migrate to our skies and rock faces, the North Atlantic humpback whale that comes to our warm waters to give birth to and nurse their young, the critically endangered hawksbill turtle, and the St. Vincent parrot. These are all creatures that the National Trust seeks to protect for future generations. For more than 40 years, the National Trust has worked to save St. Vincent and the Grenadines' most beloved places, landscapes, and seascapes where great moments of history took place. We work together with communities to value and protect important pieces of our cultural community, national history, and environment, such as the series of decorated celluloid pots found in Clear Valley, signifying that St. Vincent's civilization is almost 2,000 years old. We do this all because the next generation needs to know our stories, as they will only inherit the places and species we choose to save today. We urge you to plant a tree under whose shade you never plan to sit. Join the National Trust today.